Mr. Landry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Admiral, the Coast Guard has still not released the final rulemaking on the automatic identification system. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And as you know, there are many unanswered questions, even if it is feasible for the domestic supply industry to comply with the NOA regulations. Wouldn't it be better for the Coast Guard resources, a better use of Coast Guard resources to provide more certainty and provide more certainty for the industry if the Coast Guard put domestic compliance with NOA on the back burner for now and focus on laying down the rules of the road as it pertains to AIS? And once the AIS is tested and the Coast Guard finds itself needing more domain awareness, then returning back to notice of arrival?
As I understand, sir, with respect to notice of arrival, what we're looking at is adding notice of departure requirements and then changing somewhat the requirements for people who would have to provide notice of arrival information in addition to the AIS carriage requirement component of that notice.
A notice of departure, could you explain?
It would be a notice of that would be required prior to departure from a port for a vessel, so that you have an awareness of both the entry of the vessel as well as its intended departure.
Well, what happens to the supply vessels down in my district that basically move around from, they leave port and then go from one rig to another rig to another rig and then back to that port again? The problem we're having is that they don't, when they leave, they may be detoured to go to a different rig, and then it's kind of like a, kind of like a UPS guy goes from house to house to house, but sometimes they may bring him a package to send to another house. You see what I'm saying? I'm trying to understand how a notice of departure would help.
No, yes, sir. I see exactly what you're saying, and I'll be honest with you. I'd have to look at the specific rule as it applies to that. But my thinking is that it would be both unrealistic for us and unwieldy for us to even worry about those kinds of things. I mean, what we're really looking at is, first of all, what's a normal operation out there? So let me get to you with the answer specifically with respect to OSVs, but I don't believe that it would require them to report every single rig that they
well, because I'm having a bigger problem with foreign flag vessels, okay, entering our ports and basically providing services in the Gulf of Mexico in a clear violation of the Jones Act. And so we have foreign flag vessels that if they have an AIS system and they turn it off, the Coast Guard just says, don't do that. But then when our supply vessels would fail to comply with NOA, they would be fined. And so we basically, in my opinion, are placing a greater burden on our domestic fleet than we're placing on our foreign fleet. And yet, I thought that these regulations and this rulemaking were made to try to get a grip on exactly who's coming in and out of the ports.
Yes, sir. That is the reason for the rulemaking is for awareness of coming in and out of ports. With respect to specific actions that have been taken against U.S. flag versus foreign flag, I'd be happy to look into some specific concerns that you have. I'm not aware of those instances that you refer to, but the purpose behind AIS is specifically to understand, or the required for carriage of AIS is to understand who's operating, how they're operating, and where they're operating.
Well, but the problem is that as I see it, we're putting a bigger burden on our domestic fleet while we're letting the foreign vessels operate really without any penalty. And so the cost of doing business by that domestic fleet is raised by your regulation, and basically the cost of that foreign fleet hasn't changed. So then the day rates on the foreign fleet vessels stay the same, and our domestic vessels have to raise their rates. Do you understand? You're putting a greater burden on our people.
Well, I don't believe that was the intention, sir. I'd be happy to look into the detail on that. I'm not aware of the fact that the foreign fleet is evading any of the same requirements if they're operating coming in and out of U.S. ports.
Well, and I appreciate that comment. I really do, because the chairman was so grateful to work with us last year, and in certain language clarifying that Congress never intended NOA to apply to domestic vessels, and it passed the House of Representatives. And so my question is, do y'all feel like the language that the House put out and the intent in clarifying that intent is just something that you can ignore and continue to move the NOA forward and apply it to domestic vessels?
No, sir. I mean, I pay a lot of attention to congressional intent. It's how we can interpret what the law really means for us. So I certainly pay attention to the intent of Congress. It's one of the questions I ask. What was the intent behind the legislation that was passed, and how do we meet that intent most effectively?
Well, we've passed that. I'd like you to take a look at that language if you don't mind, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.